You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Lockhart, Texas. As a recent attack, a hit piece called me the tattooed Gen X firefighter who is skeptical of lockdowns and vaccines. Imagine that. Imagine being skeptical of those things, but I digress. Let's get to the subject at hand today. And my guest, C.Jay Engel, is back on the show. He has not been on this show in several years. So for a lot of you guys, it's going to be someone new. And for the really old school listeners, way back from when the show was called Death to Tyrants, you're going to probably remember C.Jay Engel. He's got a great Substack, and we're going to detail one of the pieces he wrote in that. The Substack is called Contra Mordor, and he wrote a piece called Why I'm Not a Libertarian. And, you know, this is not an attack on libertarians or even really libertarianism, but CJ was a libertarian, and he details in this piece why he's not now. I find it relevant for a number of reasons. One being that it's interesting, at least, because I'm a former libertarian, but also I know a lot of you are as well. And I should say also, a lot of you still are. This is not personal. This is not, hey, we're better. We got through that dumb thing you're into. It's none of that. It's just a good discussion. And I think it's very insightful, relevant, and feel free to disagree. You're more than welcome to do that. I've got a lot of friends that are libertarians, and I don't have anything against them. You know, I don't have many friends that are far lefties, but I think that worldview entails something completely different these days. But again, I digress. Let's get to this episode. Also subject of that hit piece I mentioned up front was Father John Whiteford, the wonderful guest that we had last week. I'm so happy that a lot of you guys enjoyed that episode on Great Lent. If you did not get to it yet, and that's a subject you're interested in, I highly recommend going back and checking that out. And I always have a great time talking to Father John Whiteford, and I always have a great time talking to next week's guest too, another man who, let's say, might be in similar circles as C.Jay Engel, a friend of mine and someone who's not been on the show in quite some time. There's your hint. And let's see, take care of this business too before we get to CJ is, if you'd like to be a supporter of this show, patreon.com/counterflow, $5 or more per month get you in the group. This month, my priest is the guest of our special Zoom session for my supporters. Father Ignatius, I affectionately call him Father Iggy, will be the guest, and it's an Ask a Priest Anything. It's an AMA. Father Iggy has been gracious enough to join us for that. I'll get the date out quite soon. He's got some family things he's juggling, as well as he's, an Orthodox priest, and it's Lent, right? So it's a busy time for him. But this month, the month of March, he will be our guest. So if you want to join that club, come on in. Now, let's get to a man who says he's a Reformed Catholic, anti-modernist, a traditionalist, reactionary, right-wing, heritage American, does a lot of good work over at the Chronicles magazine podcast, a lot of great work at Contra Mordor Substack. My old friend, C.Jay Engel, is back on the show. C.J., welcome back, man. How are you?
Thank you. Have I been on before?
Yeah, when it was Death to Tyrants.
Okay. I forget. It's that was a whole world away from me, as
too.
we'll talk about today. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Unintentionally got us right into the topic. It has been a long time. I've followed what you do for a long time, and I've always loved your writing and the stuff. It's almost like, I hate this word, I've said it many times, the word journey, but you've been on one yourself. So we'll get into this stuff, but first go ahead and give my audience an intro for you, anything they'll find pertinent for this discussion.
Yeah, well, I have been on a journey, and I hate that word too, but it's a good descriptive. So, what I do is, well, for a living, I don't make any money producing content. I do host the Chronicles Magazine podcast. That's a lot of fun, and I do that for them. We started it last year, but it kind of petered out, but we relaunched it this year, and it's going pretty well. It's going a lot better than it did. So that'll be every Friday, and it's live. And if you don't know Chronicles Magazine, I mean, it's the best outlet for paleoconservative thought, and it's sort of headlined by Paul Gottfried, who's the chief editor over there, who's a personal hero and influencer in my own life too. So Chronicles Magazine podcast, and I'm also involved in publishing an Anglican magazine, the North American Anglican. They used to be an online, well, they still are an online website, but they're producing a physical journal now, and so I'm publishing that for them, and it's just part of my own journey, as it were, that same thing. So those are the two main things that I do. I have a couple podcasts. I'm pretty active on Twitter, more active than I should be, and then I write on Substack probably once a week, sometimes more if I'm energized. But those are the things that you find on me. I don't make money at any of this stuff. I have my own physical in-person business that I do with a brother and my father. And so it's nice to separate the actual work of putting food on the table with the world of exercising my intellectual muscles, so to speak. So that's a little bit of background.
Are you Anglican, I guess?
It's a good question. I say that historically I am. Historically I fall in that mold. I just, everything is so subverted and corrupted that it's hard for me. Like in California, I live in California. We can talk about religion because I think that's a major part of where I am. But
yes,
where I live in California, you don't just go down to the local parish or anything like that. Everything's been gayified. That's just the way things are in the institutional mainline church. So I don't attend an Anglican church. It would be completely inappropriate for my desire to raise my 4 children in a way that's consistent with our heritage. So we go to a simple church that is good for their cultural development, their instincts. They have a community of homeschoolers there. That's good for them. It makes no sense to rip them out of that in order to LARP as if we lived in the 17th century. You know what I mean?
Wow. Okay.
So, and I know you struggle with this too. I mean, the world is in chaos, and we're all looking for things that are rooted deep in our past religiously. So that's something that I struggle with. So I consider myself as historically oriented to the Church of England, but in an age of chaos, I do what I can.
Yeah, well put. I knew California was bad, obviously, but I didn't know that it had gotten the tentacles into stuff like the Anglican Church as well. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned your Substack, and I'll show this piece for those watching. This one grabbed my attention recently, a piece you wrote called "Why I'm Not a Libertarian," a personal reflection. And a lot of people that listen to this show went on a similar, here we go again, journey as myself and you, where we, when I started this show as Death to Tyrants, it was hardcore anarcho-capitalist libertarian show, albeit the right, what I would consider the right side of the libertarian spectrum, the Mises Institute, Lou Rockwell, and people like this. But it's changed over time. And then there was a group of us that some labeled post-libertarian. And so this has kind of been a public journey of sorts. And I should start this also by saying libertarians still listen to the show. I'm not putting this episode out to knock them, or I still have plenty of libertarian. I sound like I have a black friend. I still have plenty of libertarian friends, and this is not a knock on them personally. It's just a discussion I find interesting as when someone else leaves the libertarian sphere, why this happened, and want to compare my own thoughts and perspectives. So all that being said, I think it's best to, well, let me ask you this. Before we start with your definition of libertarianism, what prompted you to write this article?
Well, on one hand, I do have a lot of friends from that world that still call themselves that. And sometimes they're frustrated or confused about why I distance myself from not only the label, but really the ethos of libertarianism. But they are also dealing with their own, frustrations with it, because they've defined themselves into it in a way that it's really difficult to get out.
Yes.
And yet at the same time, you'd have to be crazy to not recognize that there's something seriously wrong with the libertarian world. The movement. Jeff Deist, talks about how much he hates the idea of a libertarian movement.
Yeah.
And it's really, and I don't mean this in a mean way, but it's really pathetic at this point. That doesn't mean all libertarians are pathetic. I
Right.
wouldn't call Tom Woods pathetic, but
Right.
the movement at large is really embarrassing. And I think for a lot of self-described right-leaning libertarians, they're embarrassed by it.
Yes.
And so they're that, in fact, that was one of the main reasons I began to distance myself from it. There was an essay I read by Richard Weaver called "Up from Liberalism."
Yes.
And he talks about his own journey, because he started, as so many paleoconservatives did. They actually started off in sort of Marxist world, and he began to realize early on that there was something pathetic about the communist movements in America and in Europe that really made him want to distance himself from them. Even though he was still ideologically a Marxist, he realized that he would rather spend time with a community that were non-ideologically formed, that had similarities with him, that he could build communion with, and just practice continuity with that heritage as it has been developed over time. That was way more important to him than meeting up with a bunch of radicals who did adhere to the same propositions as him, but who were culturally in a completely different world as he was. He said, where should I spend my time? Where can I find meaning in life? And it was not in the ideological propositions. And I think reading that type of essay, it made me realize that I was in the same place. I wasn't comfortable with, so they had that, what was that movement where everyone was going to move to New Hampshire and set up a libertarian
The Free
utopia
State.
or whatever?
Free State Project.
Yeah, there's some good people involved with that for sure. But I realized, why would I rip myself from my roots where people are not ideologically inclined to go join this ideologically defined society where I actually didn't get along or have anything in common with them?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was this weird juxtaposition between the ideological purity
Mm-hmm.
and the need of humans to be engaged in a rooted community. And I think that's kind of what set me off.
Yeah. As you're saying these things, I'm like, right. It's a lot of the same things I was going through. And you come at it in this paper, when you define libertarianism from the deontological approach. First, let's say, what is that? And then second, why that approach? And we'll kind of give I think this will bring into your definition of libertarianism as well.
I've never been all that interested in politics as pure utilitarianism. Like, we're going to set up a political society that where the objective of the political society is to reach some end, and we have to pick what tools we want to reach that end. That's kind of your utilitarianism. So there's a lot of libertarians that say, well, the objective is to increase the material abundance of a political society. Therefore, we need the free market. The free market is the best mechanism in order to attain that goal. That's sort of utilitarianism. Like, it's, what is best for the greatest number of people kind of thing. I've never really been interested in that. And that's sort of the utilitarian. Like, you would find people like, and you could say Ludwig von Mises, but there's also David Friedman and people like that just, what is the policy or political rules of engagement that should be drawn up in order to achieve some given end. That's the utilitarian view. And Murray Rothbard and Hans Hoppe and all of them, they critiqued Mises on precisely that topic. He was a utilitarian, and they realized that there were so many other concerns that should be brought to attention. And it also doesn't address the fact of, what if the political leaders or political rulers of a society aren't interested in human flourishing or anything like that? Obviously, they aren't. So utilitarian type liberalism never really appealed to me. I never went in that direction. I was more interested in discovering what is the most just society. So, what are the propositions that are consistent with some universal ethic, right? So it was very ethic oriented. And I think that's deep inside our Anglo-American heritage as well. When we think about things like John Locke and his right to life, liberty, and property, libertarianism was sort of the fruition, the purification of some of those themes. It it got rid of all the things that were not consistent with life, liberty, and property, got rid of those things, and purified the definitions down to this body of political theory that could be said to be consistent with, starting principles. It was very deductive, it was very logical, very rationalistic, but it was basically rooted in rights, ethics. What does it mean for something to be socially wrong? If I murder you, that's an ethical problem. And so, what are the implications of some of those starting points? And that's sort of the deontological approach, the ethic and principled approach to libertarianism. And that's where I had always, found myself.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask you this. Do you still have an appreciation for Austrian economics and what that can teach us or give us, or the perspective that shows?
Yeah, one of the things I like about Austrian economics, and this is sort of a hard thing to engage on the right, because they have a distaste for free market on some things, and there's a reason for that. But I think the thing that I draw from Austrian economics is it undermines the hubris of the experts in society.
Yes,
the
right.
idea that the managers of society can know enough to tinker with society so that it brings us to a whole new material level. I think Austrian economics is most powerful when it's descriptive and not prescriptive. A lot of people don't get this, but Austrian economics is not meant to blueprint out the ideal economic policy. What it's meant to do is think through the consequences of acting in certain ways at the political level. And I think that descriptive nature of monetary policy or interventionism, I think, is still extremely useful. And so, like, you think of traditionalists like Roger Scruton, he's always referencing Mises and Böhm-Bawerk and some of those critics of Marxism in order to make his case that we need to think about the consequences of trusting in the experts to manage society. And I think that's the strongest aspect of Austrian economics. The other thing that it does is it describes the organic nature of economic relations. The economy is not something that's conceived of in a boardroom. The economy is something that's much more organic and rooted and has to do with our daily lives at a much more organic and natural level. And I think those are strengths of Austrian economics that I still take with me, and they help me to defeat the logic of Marxism, interventionism. We don't live in a free market society.
Right.
And I think Austrian economics can really grapple with that in a way that's unique to them.
For the purposes of this discussion, if you reference classical liberalism or liberalism, can we say that that's basically what you mean as libertarianism also?
I think so. I would say libertarianism is classical liberalism purified.
Okay.
I would say there were aspects of classical liberalism that were inconsistent with itself, and libertarianism worked out all those little contradictions and purified it. So sure, but yeah, for the sake of the argument, we can unite those two. Okay.
Did classical liberalism, in your mind, give us the liberalism we know of today?
Yeah. So what happened was, in my opinion, classical liberalism. I think of it as very contextual, very historicist. It came about in the context of political relations in England, mostly in Britain. That would be the historicist tradition of classical liberalism. They were trying to solve problems for their own interest groups over against the interests and objectives of the royalists or whatever. So when I think of those contextual aspects of liberalism, what happens is when you draw them out of their context and you universalize them and you make them the sort of dogma by which political society can be judged, that's when you're basically transforming classical liberalism as a historicist thing into a universalist thing. And that's the transformation from classical to modern liberalism, is this attempt to universalize the interests and needs of a particular society, specifically in England. In fact, that's where I would draw the difference between French instincts of liberalism and English instincts of liberalism. The former is historicist and rooted in a particular context, and the other deals with the rights of man. It tries to universalize them and rip them out of their contextual historical development and make them something that applies to every human being around the world irrespective of borders and
Right.
cultures and et cetera.
Right. It seems like that might have fueled the neoconservative movement as well. Do you see that?
Yeah, I think the neoconservatives are very universalistic in
Yes.
the same way.
Right.
And they take these concepts like rights, individual rights, and they universalize them, and then they have the need to spread them.
Yes.
Since they are applicable to all societies everywhere, they have to export them from our own context. We're the what's the phrase? We're the end of history. We've triumphed in the contest of various political orders, and we've been the zenith of political development. And so therefore we need to take these things that we discovered and apply them to other cultures around the world. And there's problems with that, as people have predicted that. But I think that does describe the ethos of neoconservatism in a way unique to them and against paleo or traditionalist conservatism.
Yes. Did you have, or do you have, a problem within this libertarian, a little bit within the libertarian sphere, but certainly in classical liberalism, saying that our rights come from God?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I'm writing an essay on that right now. So I think there are tendencies to abuse that. So the problem is that if rights come from God, that is itself a universalist statement.
Yes.
Right? Because then the rights aren't rooted in a particular tradition. They are something that do apply to all people. On the other hand, I don't believe that rights come from the managerial state. I don't think the state itself as an entity, as a corporation, it arbitrarily creates rights. I mean, that's what you get in the 20th century, where the state is the engine. It is the thing that generates and produce creates the managerial system creates all these widgets, but it also creates rights. And these rights are discovered and churned out almost on a weekly basis. We used to have gay rights, now we have trans rights, and so on. These things are just constantly produced. So I don't think it comes from the managerial state. What I would say is it does come from God, but not directly. So it comes indirectly through history. In other words, I have a very Burkean mindset where there's an element of providence, that if God wants to deliver rights to man, he does through the development, the organic development of political society, so that the rights are discovered and made concrete over time, over historical development. That's sort of the Burkean understanding of rights, is they're taken from abstractions and turned into concrete things that are imputed into a constitution of a people, and therefore that makes them rights. So you take universal principles, and the objective of a political society is to transform these universal principles into something that can be called a right. So the rights aren't something that we use to undermine the political society, but we rather receive them and were benefits of our ancestors identifying these rights and integrating them into a political society. And so not only are there rights integrated into a political society, but there's also obligations and there's also duties.
Yes.
And these things are all mixed, together. And so one person can't say my rights trump my obligations, because that's not how rights are conceived within the nexus, the complex of a social order. So rights and duties are discovered through history, and God works himself out through history, and that's what we describe as providence.
You wrote a piece in 2020 called "The Triumph of the Political," and you went over 3 authors that I think were impactful in pulling a lot of people away from libertarianism, in my experience, certainly me. Burnham, Schmidt, and Gramsci. Can you go over how maybe that started this pull away from libertarianism? But you also do mention it wasn't enough, you needed more than that. But how did that start?
Yeah, well, like I said, I would say there's 5 angles of my problem with libertarianism. The first one was what I mentioned with Weaver, and the need for a community, some sort of social grounding for man, independent of just propositional purity. That was the first thing. The second thing was, but even still, even if man does need that, that doesn't mean that the propositions themselves are false, right? So I hadn't yet defined myself out of libertarianism. So the process of defining myself out of libertarianism was described in that essay that you mentioned, why I'm not a libertarian. So that's where I get into Burke and things like that. But the three people that you mentioned, I consider to be the most significant weaknesses of libertarianism. So Burnham's case is that libertarianism fails to recognize the realistic dynamics of power, that power is something that cannot be confronted with a good argument. Just because someone comes up with the best ethical theory doesn't mean that power is threatened in any way. So if you want to benefit from living in a free world, you have to use power to confront other blocks of power, because those other blocks of power are not interested in listening to your ideology, right? So I don't think libertarianism, a lot of people, they don't want to engage in politics at all because it's unethical, right? You would take people like Bob Murphy, who's a great guy. I have no problem with this person, but he doesn't engage in politics, and I don't think freedom will come out of a situation where we refuse to engage in the realism of power dynamics. So that would be Burnham. The second one is Schmidt and his concept of the political. For Schmidt, the problem with libertarianism is it pretends like it can depoliticize things that are inherently political. Mm-hmm. So you can have things that there are certain groupings in the world that are interested in setting forth their political vision. And those people are not interested in your ideology either. They want to conquer you and they want to subdue you because they are not interested. They want to undermine you because you're in their way of, setting their own political vision. And so you have to come to terms with, what is the nature of the political. First, the political order has to be established. If there's no political order established, then you're not going to have things like freedom, which come out of, the political conflicts. And so that's kind of the Schmittian way is, if Burnham's focused on power, Schmidt is focused on the nature of the political, and he undermines claims of like legal superiority, that there's this law that's above man that we all adhere to. He says that the political is foundational, the political order has to be established, then we can talk about things like law. But at the end of the day, the political is more foundational than the legal. The last one is Gramsci, and I consider this one of the biggest weaknesses of libertarianism, because he realized that he could get his way, he could fulfill his own political vision by radicalizing private society, right? So when you go and march through the institutions and you radicalize the academy, the banking sector, the church, all these private institutions, well, the libertarian can't say that there's a political solution to that. They just have to say, well, that's the free market at work. These institutions have been radicalized, but it's their right as providers of goods and services and to do that to people, to ban Christians or whatever they want to do. It's their right as the owners of the property. I think that in itself is a very difficult problem for libertarians, that they don't really have the tools to deal with. I think this is a new problem. I think it's a 20th century problem. But what Gramsci does is he basically, he peeled off the layers of cultural hegemony that had built up for 1,000 years. And he basically said, we're going to radicalize that base, and then capturing the state is easy. Because the problem with taking a Leninist perspective for Gramsci in the West is that the civil society didn't depend on the organs of state. In Russia, they did. If you could kill the Tsarist family, if you could kill the Tsarist regime like the Bolsheviks did, yes, you've captured Russia. Mm-hmm. Here, if you captured, the White House or whatever, right, and civil society was still strong, it'd be a really uneasy relationship, and it wouldn't last. The civil society in the West has been much stronger. So Gramsci realized that you needed to radicalize, subvert, and undermine civil society, and that would help capture the political. Once the political organs are captured after you've radicalized it, you've won, right? Yes, and I don't think there's a libertarian solution to that. So those are the three weaknesses of libertarianism. But again, none of those three actually undermine the specific claims of libertarianism, which is that it is most just for an individual to have his full property rights, et cetera.
Yes, yeah, and boy, that's a perfect transition. I have these two things I want to ask really quick, and then boy, to sound like a corporate dork, put a pin in that for a second. It's funny, in my whole career, my entire adult life's been firefighter stuff. But
Yeah.
I hear these like little corporate nerdy things in Zoom meetings, and sometimes they stick. I don't know why. Does libertarianism open itself, let's say a framework of libertarianism open itself to be subverted because of either the lack of boundaries it has, or even to be subverted within those boundaries because, hey, it's this right to do this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So your enemies can take over your system and co-opt it. Do you feel that way at all about it?
Yeah, there's two elements to that. I mean, one is it can subvert and undermine the cultural stability that a free people requires. So when you give freedom to license and you corrupt the self-governing principle of a people, society can't function well anymore. So that's one of the problems with it, is you have to have some sort of moral boundary on permissible social action. I mean, when you fill a society with like sexual perversion, this creates a level of anarchy that only a totalitarian state can deal with. So you're setting the groundwork for increased statism when you have like a licentious understanding of individual rights. But the other thing it does too is by refusing to place some sort of boundaries on who has the ability to contest for power. Like, so if you say that, in our libertarian society, we're not going to put any, religious tests, metaphysical tests, cultural tests. Anybody can pursue positions of power. It's open to everybody. What happens is you get radicals who aren't interested in the same freedoms that you want to defend. Yeah. So it opens up society. It opens up the political order. And this is exactly this is the lesson of Carl Schmitt. I mean, people are like, oh, Carl Schmitt, he laid the groundwork for Adolf Hitler. But what he was actually saying in the 1920s is that if somebody doesn't put a boundary on this, either a revolutionary leftist or a revolutionary rightist is going to capture the reins of power, because we have a crisis right now. And so by refusing to set a boundary on, what is permissible, what types of groups can capture power, by refusing to set a boundary on that, you're opening the doors to some really bad situations. And that's exactly what happened with Hitler. I mean, he came in because there was nothing that said anybody with a revolutionary right-wing or left-wing, ideology, there's nothing that would prevent them from running for office. So those are the types of opening up the gates to the castle that basically make liberalism a sort of suicidal pact.
When you discussed Gramsci's theory, that it worked, not just it's more than a theory, of taking over let's say, civil society, do you think in the long run, bringing us to where we're at now, it killed our civilization?
Liberalism or just the Gramscian method, or
both and?
Yeah, so I think what happened is the West had a liberal mentality. They forgot the ancient fact that there are enemies in the world, and that there's a reason for castle walls and there's a reason for a castle door. And when liberalism has this mentality of we're going to neglect the reality of enemies, what happens is enemies are allowed to come in. And so liberalism opened the door, and that mentality, it made us unaware of the fact that there were people seeking to undermine Western civilization. So liberalism wasn't necessarily the enemy, but it was the putting your head down in the face of an attack. And so what I consider Gramsci to represent is, the march on the fort. That's what they are, and the liberals let them in. The liberals are not the enemy. They're just completely ambivalent about human nature and political reality. And I do think that people like Gramsci had nefarious objectives. He struggled with, how do I undermine, what he considered to be like, the things that we consider now about our system, like that it's too patriarchal, it's fascist, like all these things came about in Gramsci's mind, and he realized that you had to subvert civil society. But civil society is the basis of civilization. So when you undermine that, civilization comes crumbling down with it.
Okay, now back to where we were. You mentioned something about the individual's relation to society.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where this discussion will start to, again, in your mind, as you started to get further and further away from libertarianism, I think this might have been a key aspect of it.
This is the key, because if the individual can rebut his social obligations by claiming his rights, that is the essence of libertarianism. But if I can undermine his capability of doing that, I'm no longer a libertarian. If society if there's structures of society that cannot be repudiated by the individual, then I'm not a libertarian anymore. And so what I begin to realize is every individual is born into a situation where there are pre-existing arrangements. There's a pre-existing structure. There's a pre-existing way of the world, and this way of the world has been built up over, on a like a waterfall layered of different social arrangements. You're born into a family, and the child can't claim to his father that his rights are being abused when his father tells him to go to bed or to eat his meal or to not, break a chair or all these rules. We come into a situation with rules. The father represents the interests of the child, and the child can't claim that his rights are being abused by his father. That's not the way of the world. That's not the social situation that we're born into is an arrangement of rights and duties, or rights and obligations. It's this mosaic of these varying rights and obligations, this network of them. And the father represents the child, and so the father can make decisions on behalf of his family. And those decisions on behalf of his family is what builds society up. And so we are the product of 1,000 years of these types of relationships and dynamics. So when we come into the world, there's already a structure that has been laid for us, and we are bound to that structure. That doesn't mean there's not problems with the structure. That doesn't mean we can't participate in changes or anything like that. It doesn't mean that the totalitarianism and tyranny is inevitable, but we have to realize that the existence of this network of rights and duties is something that pre-exists ourselves, and our obligation as individuals is to participate in that society. And it's better to participate in a society. There's going to be more freedom when you have a good society than if you're left alone on an island. And if you conceive of things that way. So that's kind of how I realized it is society precedes the individual. This is the particularist, like paleo-conservative mentality. This is the lesson of not only Edmund Burke, but also people like Joseph de Maistre in France. He said he had never met a human being. He'd only met, Frenchmen and Spaniards and Englishmen, but society precedes us and shapes us, and we are downstream from society. Society is not downstream from us as individuals.
Mm-hmm. And I was reminded when I read this particular part of your piece, Rothbard, when he was, now a lot of times it was discussing economics, not necessarily like, let's say, culture or anything like that, but he would always do the guy on the island by himself. And then you add one more person, the dynamics between that. It did always separate in theory, like, well, let's start with the man by himself, as opposed to what you're saying is like, no, you that doesn't make any sense. You don't do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is the great switch. If you conceive of society in that way, you miss the fact that there's already structures in you miss the realist aspect of political theory. I think one of the bridges that I used, a lot of other people used to get out of libertarianism was Hans Hoppe's covenant, his covenant theory or whatever.
Community, yeah, right.
Yeah, covenant community. What you begin to realize is if you're born into that community where there's already been things set up, you don't have the ability to transcend the community and make it adhere to your stipulations. You have to submit to its stipulations. And one of the benefits of living in the West is that one of the stipulations of political society in the West is that the state has certain restrictions over our lives. So what we're not saying is that politics is absolute, power is absolute and arbitrary, and they can do whatever they want to me. But actually, there is a complex that has carved out spheres of freedom for individuals in a way I think unique to Western society. And so that's one of the benefits of living downstream from that heritage, is that our society has afforded for us liberties, and there's no reason we can't claim those in our opposition to abuse of power. This is our heritage. Liberty is our heritage. It doesn't have to be some absolute universal. It can be something that's part of who we are as inheritors, as heirs of the Western tradition.
Are man's rights more fundamental than the political order itself?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that the integrity of the political order is the basis for rights. I think pursuing individual rights over against the stability of the order is how you get the consequences of revolutionary France. Right. I think this is one of the great lessons of political history. There's this great book, if anyone wants to, read one of the books that really influenced me. It's not Mark Levin's, Yuval Levin. I think that's his name, but it's called The Great Debate. It was basically the birth of left and right. Yeah, it was basically elaborating on the conflict of visions between Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine. Yep. But one of the things that Edmund Burke says is the unilateral pursuit of individual freedom over against the political order will make man realize that he actually will miss the very thing that he's pursuing. If you want to increase liberty and you pursue it unilaterally over against tradition, over against, political continuity, political structure, political order, what you're going to find at the end of the day is not utopia, but death. I mean, this was one of the most powerful arguments that he made, is you can sit there all day and you can blueprint out the just society. But when you begin to pull at that thread of political society, you don't find emancipation at the end of that. You find tyranny. It's one of the paradoxes of man, that man has limits in what he's able to pursue for himself, and we need to be pious toward those limits. And I think that's one of the lessons that that Burkeanism brings forth, is having this revolutionary mindset, this emancipatory mindset. It doesn't bring out freedom; it actually brings out Napoleon.
I want to ask you about, you've mentioned it a few times, paleoconservatism. We can also relate it to paleo-libertarianism. I know Lou Rockwell and Paul Gottfried, Murray Rothbard back in the day had these meetings and discussions. Talk about paleo-libertarianism, the value, if at all, any you see in that, and then we'll get into paleoconservatism.
Yeah, so I think what the paleo-libertarians realized, there's several things. One, they realized that they had to be realistic about politics. And, the paleo-libertarians began to realize that they could sit there and blueprint out their ideal society all day long, but they still had to deal with the problem, which in the 90s was I wouldn't say like a darkening of the managerial state, because that had long passed, but there's new elements of the managerial system that was coming to much more significantly subvert our cultural heritage, and they realized they needed to do something practical about it, independent of the theory. That was the one thing about paleo-libertarians, is they realized that something practical had to be done. You had to participate in something. Pat Buchanan was better than George Bush. Right. So those are the other thing, though, is that there was a corruption of libertarianism. It began to associate itself with regime interests. David Gordon has a great series of essays on this, on the corruption of the Cato Institute and the rise of the regime libertarians. And libertarianism began to be an outlet, or what should I call it? Like an outpost of regime interests. It began to morph. It began to rationalize and justify the interests of the managerial state in libertarian terms. This is so obvious now today. You could see how Cato and other regime libertarians reacted to COVID. But in foreign policy and the immigration problem, basically libertarianism as a movement, Libertarianism Inc. is basically an outpost of regime interests. Yes. And they called that early in the 90s. And so one of the things that they wanted to do was they wanted to a mix between mock and degradate and undermine the objectives and momentum of the regime libertarians. So that, I think, it was a completely healthy society, but also they helped they help contribute to our understanding of the managerial state. Like, even if you're not in theory a libertarian, I think some of the best critiques of the managerial state in the 20th century political order have come from libertarianism. Like Murray Rothbard's dissection of the progressive era is extremely influential, not only for libertarians, but like for paleoconservatives like Paul Gottfried and Sam Francis and others. Even they had a tense relationship maybe, but even like Russell Kirk, I think, benefited in some way from the paleo-libertarian critique of the managerial system.
Yeah. Let's, there's going to be people that hear this and do the, I forgot that lady's name that interviewed Jordan Peterson along to Cassie something or other, but.
Yeah, Kathy Young, I think.
So what you're saying is you want statism or something like this. So if for those people and, for the audience at large who are curious thinkers, what sort of political situation would you find appropriate for a society that you would like to live in?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've really began to absorb is the objective of political theory, of politics, is to not blueprint out the ideal society. I think in some ways it's important to have those sort of ideals, but the essence of politics is using particular situationally laden tools to address particular problems in society. So the libertarian can get into this thing where he spends a lot of bandwidth talking about the privatization of Mars, for instance. And how does a libertarian world deal with those problems? I don't think our freedoms benefit from those types of conversations. And we live in a world where, they're trying to take our kids, whom they want to trans, on one hand, they are completely undermining the ability of the people to live free and prosperous lives, to afford their mortgages or their rents, to afford food. I mean, we have to deal with actual political problems. So one of the things that like this paleo-conservative mindset brings to me is that politics is always like that. There's never a perfect society. We're not starting as Robinson Crusoe drawing out the ideal situation. For over 2,000 years of Western, post, Christ, Western political life, every decade has its own problems. And we're always in a state of flux. We're always dealing with new threats, new enemies, new friends. Yesterday's enemies don't have to be today's enemies. Like people talk about the clash between, Roman Catholics and, the reformers in political society. I don't think that animates our political life anymore. We can be friends now in a place where those were the conflict between like the Protestants and the Roman Catholics basically was about the stability of society itself in those times. It's not today. So our friends change, our enemies change, our threats change, the tools that we can use to confront our enemies change. So all these things are in constant flux. And so saying that like in 2024, we have this particular situation where we need to abandon libertarian ideals to address much more significant problems, that's actually the way of human life. We're always in a place of having to deal with these things. We never are afforded the opportunity to blueprint out the ideal society. And so one of the things that I've really absorbed is that I don't think in terms of idealizing out, how society should be run, but rather, where does my heritage guide me, and what things should I pursue in the here and now to reconnect with that heritage, and also to defend my community, defend my friends, and combat those people that basically want me to not exist anymore. They want to undermine and repudiate my heritage, and I have to think of ways and strategies and solutions to defend it.
Mm-hmm. Well put. All right. In closing, we're going to play a game. I'm going to name people that you know who they are. I know who they are. My audience, a lot of them will know who they are. And just give me a few words of what you think when you hear these names. Hans Hermann Hoppe.
The bridge from libertarianism to paleoconservatism. I think, he recognizes the dangers of regime narratives. He recognizes, what exactly is happening in the world in this left-wing revolution. And he also recognizes the function that the state has played in that. We shouldn't overlook the fact that we do live in a world where culture is downstream from politics. And that's one of great contributions of libertarianism. On the other hand, I don't think there's a necessity to do what he does in every time you want to address an issue, you have to take it back to libertarian first principles. So I would say that's sort of a weakness of Hoppe that's unnecessary for our time. But on the other hand, he's much better than all the regime libertarians and all the utopian liberals out there.
Lew Rockwell.
I think he's a hero. So I might have, particulars disagreements in the same way as I would with Hans Hoppe, but one of the benefits of Lew Rockwell is he's actually been a conduit that we can swim through to reawaken aspects of the old right. There's people like, the Taft Republicans, Garrett Garrett, Albert J. Nock, all of these great anti-managerial revolution liberals and conservatives back then that I don't think I would have even heard about if it wasn't for Lew Rockwell. So there's, just the pre-war right, the Goldwaters, the Charles Lindberghs, the America First tradition. So much of that has been kept alive by people like Lew Rockwell.
Yeah, when I got to go up to his office, which I think was on the 3rd floor, if that's what it was, at the Mises Institute, and we talked for a little while. And I told him that because of him, I was getting into the writers, the old conservative, like some of the guys, Garrett Garrett and whatnot. And he said, well, when you do a book on those people, come here and do the research.
Yeah.
And he was being genuine and serious. I'm like, oh my God.
See, Lew Rockwell, you might disagree with his anarcho-capitalism or whatever, but there's something about the political context that he came from, the circles that he ran in his 20s, that are very consistent with our own need as Americans in 2024 to reconnect with pre-managerial voices. I mean, you don't have to choose between this universalist abstract libertarianism and this totalitarianism. We have a heritage of criticism against the managerial state. And I think Lew Rockwell kept that alive in a way that I think not even a lot of other conservatives, like the American conservative, they don't spend a lot of time in these areas, but Lew Rockwell does and did. And there's books on the Mises Institute that are not libertarian or anarchist or whatever, but they are very much part of our heritage, and they're extremely important in understanding that our critique of the managerial state is rooted in our own American past.
Pat Buchanan.
The hero we didn't deserve. I mean, Pat Buchanan, I love Ron Paul, but Pat Buchanan is in so many ways he represents a statesmanship that we never deserved in the late 20th century. I mean, he more than anyone cared for the American people as a people. When I see Pat Buchanan, I see him as representing heritage America. He represents legacy America in a way that the neoconservative establishment and the liberal establishment have really gone to great lengths to undermine and destroy. Pat Buchanan is a hero of the forgotten America. And he when you hear him talk, like when he gave his culture war speech for the George Bush nomination, I think it was the nomination in the early 90s. Yep. It's not just the content itself, but you can hear in his voice, the posturing, the way he presents the problem. He represents like a sort of 1940s America that is sort of nostalgic, I think, for people who are beginning to recognize how far we've come.
Ron Paul.
The man who started it all. I mean, none of us people. I used to criticize those who talked about a libertarian to alt-right pipeline, but the pipeline was real, and Ron Paul was sort of an entryway for that because he taught us that it was appropriate, it was acceptable to critique the entire regime, not just the Democratic Party. You have to step back from regime interests and realize that the Republican and Democratic Party are basically, they're offspring from the same root problems. And the Republican Party is not the solution. And Ron Paul called BS on all of their objections and visions. And he also called BS on their ability to manipulate heritage America by using, key rhetoric, by appealing to their emotions, their sense of patriotism. And they basically abused those things to capture power in America. And Ron Paul called balderdash on the whole enterprise.
All right, two more. Paul Gottfried.
Paul Gottfried is probably the single most influential intellectual or writer that I know, and I've gotten to know him personally. I'm working on his intellectual biography, and also a festschrift in honor of him. So Paul Gottfried, I think more than anyone, has helped me rethink history in a way that I wouldn't have been able to. And he's the one that brought me into the particularist paleoconservative fold. So he's by far, I mean, there's other people like Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre that are important for me. But Paul Gottfried, I think, is the core of everything that I believe about our Anglo-American history.
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump is sort of he's the repudiation of the regime's hubris. They thought that they could manipulate the populace into going along with their vision of things. And I think Donald Trump is hilarious because he comes from them. He's a liberal cosmopolitan from New York, probably with the possible exception of Obama, but possible. He's the most liberal, progressive president we've ever had. I mean, even Biden in the 70s and 80s is more conservative than Donald Trump. So it's hilarious that someone like him can draw the ire of our enemies, which are the regime. So I see him as sort of a proxy person to express the American people's discontent. I don't think he is the man that we need to bring things back. He's not going to help us return or bring us forth into a better world, but he is a rallying point, and he is someone that we can use to basically express our discontent toward the regime that's betrayed us and hates us.
What's the state of this current regime?
It's a good question. I see it as essentially weak and desperate. I see it full of pygmies that don't know what they're doing. They have no direction in life, and they're only oriented toward immediate profit opportunities. In the short-term run, they have no conception of longer-term political goals or objectives, and that makes them essentially weak. They're desperate. Their narratives are falling apart, and they have no way of uniting the country on a common vision or common way of life. And so I think their legitimacy is being undermined on a daily basis, not by people on the outside, not by people by me, but by their own ineptitude. On the other hand, I think that most of Western Europe and most of the world is full of weak regimes. And so the American regime is sort of still, what's the phrase? The prettiest horse in the glue factory or whatever. So as bad as everything, everyone's in the toilet, but the American regime is sort of like a gold-plated toilet at the moment.
Do you see a counter elite as a possibility of I don't know, overtaking or replacing what's going on now within your lifetime?
I do think that there are people like Musk and the PayPal mafia that have momentum on their side, but I don't have fealty to them. I don't see them as something I'm super optimistic for in terms of connecting with our own heritage and the things that are important to me, like tradition and continuity, and emphasizing our heritage. I think that they're going to defeat the left. But that doesn't mean they are the right that I'm looking for. But at the end of the day, if I'm a particularist, I have to, pick my poison, so to speak. So, maybe out of this can come something good. But I don't think they are the people that we need. But they are the people that I think will, continue that momentum forward to undermine the regime's longevity.
Do you use the friend-enemy distinction if we could discuss the current regime versus that counter-elite?
Yeah, I think that there is a friend-enemy distinction between Musk, the PayPal mafia, so to speak, and the legacy elite. In this country, for sure. I think that the definition of friend-enemy distinction is that if one takes power, the other is necessarily out of power. I think there's sort of a mutual exclusivity between the two camps. I think in a way that would make them a friend-enemy distinction. And the enemy of my enemies, might be my friend for the time being. So that's kind of the way I approach it.
All right, C.J., let's plug some things. Plug Chronicles really quick. I'll say this I'll plug it. I've been subscribing to Chronicles magazine for longer than I can calculate in my head right now. It's been a number of years and I love it. And I'll let CJ talk about it as well.
Yeah. Chronicles, they haven't been able to be as fancy as a lot of the newer, magazines and outlets online. But at the end of the day, I think it's important to find an outlet that has an element of continuity. I mean, they are the last remaining bastion of the paleoconservative world that existed in the early 90s. Even before the neoconservatives were able to achieve total hegemony over the conservative movement, there was Chronicles. Chronicles was there at the beginning, giving a platform to people like Sam Francis, Mel Bradford, Pat Buchanan was a columnist there, Murray Rothbard was a columnist there. So Chronicles represents roots, I think, American roots. It is part of their self-conscious, their self-identity, I think, is basing our own needs for a right wing in something historically grounded. This is one of the things that Paul and I, talk about often. You had one of their editors, Alan Carlson, and Alan Carlson is sort of an underappreciated writer or thinker. I think he's actually done some work in Hungary with Viktor Orban, but he was a Chronicles guy, and he emphasized the uniqueness of the old American way, of a heritage America and its particular American structure. And I don't think we can move forward in a meaningful way against the left unless we have some sort of continuity with the past. And that's what Chronicles magazine means to me. It is supportive, and it's a proponent of American civilization, but it's also a proponent and adherent of American civilization, of old American civilization and our own history and culture and heritage. And of course, it's run by Paul Gottfried, who sort of sets the pace. Without Paul Gottfried, it would be probably struggling in a much more significant way than it is now. And so I love Chronicles. They're good people, and they deserve our support.
So you do the podcast, then it drops every Friday, you said?
Yeah, I do the podcast. It's actually live every Friday.
Okay.
Last Friday it wasn't, but we made up for it on Monday. But yeah, we have Fridays, usually in the afternoon, but it depends on the guests. And finally, for those who are already aware of the podcast, you can just search Chronicles Magazine on YouTube.
Got it.
To get it. And I don't know if you have a show notes page or anything, but we can link to the
Yep.
Okay. We can link to the RSS feeds and stuff like that. But the good news is that we finally got Paul Gottfried a microphone and a camera that will help him. That will help him exist in a post-2000 world. So yes. I'm excited for that. We got it all set up. So our first conversation with him should probably drop in a couple of weeks. You'll be able to see his whole voice, or his whole face, and hear his voice. So I'm really excited for that. And I think Paul's one of the greatest people that I've ever talked to. And so his voice needs to be heard. So if you want to hear it, listen to Chronicles Magazine podcast.
I agree. Now plug your Substack too, of course.
CJEngel.substack.com. The name of it is Contra Mordor, but it's C.J. Engel, C-J-A-Y Engel. That's my full name, .substack.com to get my Substack, and then at Contra Mordor on Twitter.
Excellent. C.J. Engel, thanks for being here, man. Loved it.
It was fun. I love talking to you.
Thanks, man. Hope you guys enjoyed the chat with one C.J. Engel. And these drop every Tuesday night on the YouTube page. If you're not a subscriber to that page, go hit subscribe. As the kids say, go smash that like button, I think is what it is, and hit subscribe, whatever the case. You know what to do. And for the podcast, of course, counterflowpodcast.com. We've got the Telegram group growing and going strong. Follow me on Twitter at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. Give CJ a follow on his Substack, Contra Mordor. And until next week, when my guest is my friend, a former president of a big institution. Who is it? Leave it in the comments, see if you can guess. And we'll see you then.
You get split in half, like on the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.